Whispers in the dark.
She married him, believing love would be a shelter. Instead, it became the lock on the door. He was charming at parties, tender over dinner, careful with flowers on anniversaries. When the blinds were closed, he turned into weather that never cleared. He scolded the way rain scolds windows. He hammered the house with words and fists until even the picture frames learned to keep quiet. The neighbors waved on Sundays and never knew a storm lived next door. He rationed her phone battery. He counted her footsteps while pretending not to look. He braided apologies into ropes and tied them around her days. She packed a bag once and hid it behind the boiler. He found it before she found courage. The second time she ran, he caught her at the gate and kissed her forehead while he dragged her back inside. That night, he led her down the basement steps with a hand at the back of her neck like a dog on a leash. The bulb was a single tired eye that swung when the door closed. Moisture clung to the concrete, and the concrete clung to her breathing. He clicked a length of chain around her ankle and said he was keeping her safe from herself. He said love is a locked room, and the key is obedience. Days went thin. Nights went thick. The drip in the far corner counted time more honestly than any clock. Sometimes he brought soup. Sometimes he brought silence and let it bruise her. Loneliness smudged the edges of the world until even her name lost its corners. On the 5th or 15th or 50th night, she saw someone standing beyond the line where the bulb could not reach. A young man held himself there, as if the darkness were a shoreline, and he was unwilling to wet his shoes. His face looked like the memory of gentleness. His voice sounded like the part of the wind that does not rattle doors. "Don't be afraid," he said, and the chain turned lighter by the weight of a single word. She asked who he was, and he answered with the question she had forgotten to ask herself. "Who were you before the house taught you to whisper?" He sat with her on the cold floor and told stories about fields without fences. He told her that people could be doors and she did not have to live inside this one. When the husband came down with his belt and his wine voice, the young man stayed. He watched like a witness and spoke like a lighthouse. "You can stand," he said, "even when you cannot move. You can take back 1 inch and then another." She began to sleep in brief islands. In those islands, the young man braided her hair and unbraided her fear. He did not touch the chain, but it seemed to loosen under his gaze. Once he asked her to say her name aloud, and she could not. He said, "Then give me the name you want," and she whispered a name that tasted of air. Sometimes she doubted him. Sometimes she thought grief had opened a door in her head, and he had walked in out of pity. He did not argue. He shrugged like a prayer and kept sitting by her shoulder. She started marking the wall with a rusted nail. 1 line for each day he did not come. Another line for each day she did not cry. A third for each minute she remembered a future. The wall grew into a forest of thin trees. The young man said, "A forest is where you learn to navigate by sound. Listen." She listened. There were patterns inside the drip and the radiator cough and the distant trucks. There were pauses that felt like promises. On the night the promises snapped, her husband fell down the stairs, not by accident. With the belt still looped around his hand like a black river, he stared at the scrawled forest and laughed, as if her hope were a child's drawing. He told her he could cut each little tree with a single breath. The young man stepped from the dark, as though invited by cruelty. "Now," he said softly, "now we end the weather." Her fingers closed around a slack coil of chain on the floor. She had imagined this weight 1,000 times, and it still felt heavier than the sky. He raised the belt. She raised the chain. The air split. Sound filled the room, and then had nowhere to go. Blood made a brief red mirror on the concrete and then broke. She swung again because a lifetime of stopping had taught her only what happened when she did not. She swung because the young man's palm was on her shoulder, warm, certain, guiding the arc, as if tracing the letter of a new alphabet. When he fell, she did not notice the silence at first. Silence had always been his favorite disguise. The young man knelt and put his forehead to hers and told her she was free. He told her he had stayed as long as she needed, and now he could leave. "Please don't," she said, and used the name that tasted of air. He smiled the way a match smiles just before it goes out. "You don't need me to keep breathing," he said. "You needed me to remember how." He stepped back into the dark, and the dark closed like water. She curled beside the cooling body. She slept for a time, inside a dream where windows could open without permission. Morning arrived with boots on the stairs and radio static in the hallway. Voices parted the room like curtains. They found her holding him and speaking to someone who was not there. "It wasn't me," she told the empty air between their questions. "It was him, my love, my man. He did it for me." They asked his name. She gave them the name that tasted of air, and they looked at one another and wrote down nothing. Later they told her there were fingerprints in the blood that matched her own, and none other. Later they told her the chain had her skin on it. Later they told her no one else had been seen entering or leaving for weeks. She nodded because the measurements of the world had returned, and they were narrower than before. At night, in a bed that was not hers, the ceiling tiles stood still, and she understood that this is what freedom sometimes looks like. Stillness that startles, rooms that do not listen, air without a voice. She turned her face to the wall and missed the lighthouse. She missed the questions. She missed the tender lie that had kept her alive long enough to make a truth. They said she had created him. They said trauma can shape a person out of the shadow of a need. They said the mind is a house with many basements. She traced a new forest with her fingertip on clean paint. Outside, weather gathered over other roofs. Somewhere a window opened without permission. In the hollow of her chest, a match refused to die. If he was only a ghost, then he was the kind that leaves something real behind. She closed her eyes and said the name that tasted of air. A warm hand did not touch her, but her breath arrived anyway. It arrived and arrived and arrived, and for the first time, it belonged to her. She would speak to him sometimes, in grocery store aisles, in the hush of laundromats, in the mirror haze after a shower. He did not answer, not out loud, but the world made a small accommodating space as if listening. And when thunder rolled, she would not flinch, because storms belonged to the past and names belonged to the future. She chose a new name and kept it under her tongue like a seed. One day she would plant it. One day it would bloom into doors.